Have you ever seen a child so quiet, so still, that your heart told you to speak softly, even before you knew her name? Have you ever looked into eyes that should have known joy, but instead reflected only hunger and fear? The streets of Outpost 9 were always empty after sundown. That was the unspoken rule. Too many things prowled the perimeter, not just the cold, not just the scavengers, but the kind of eyes that didn't blink, that watched too long. People learned to stay indoors, lock the doors, bolt the shutters. But Gabe Rowan never cared for rules, especially not when his shift ended late and the engine bay still stank of burnt coolant and carbon dust. Especially not when the walk back to his cabin through the salvage quarter offered a sliver of silence he couldn't find anywhere else. That night the silence broke. Not with sound, with stillness. He saw her curled in the shadows behind the broken hull of a crashed merchant pod. Too small to be anything but a child, too thin to be anything but starving. Her knees were drawn to her chest. Her skin shimmered faintly in the low amber light of a flickering wall lamp. Pale blue, dust-streaked, scaled, alien. She didn't move when he approached, didn't speak, just stared, eyes too wide, too empty. Gabe stopped 3 meters away, raised both hands slowly, no threat, no noise, just presence. He crouched, waited. After a moment she blinked. Once, then spoke. A whisper, cracked and dry. "Are you going to sell me?" It wasn't a question born of panic, it was a routine check. Like she'd asked it before. Too many times. Gabe's jaw tightened. He shook his head. "No, kid, I'm not." Her eyes searched his face. Suspicious. Calculating. Not hopeful. Never hopeful. "You don't have to lie," she said. "Just do it quick." "I'm not lying," he said. "And I'm not leaving you here either." She looked down. Her arms tightened around her knees. "I'm not worth much," she muttered. "I'm too small." He exhaled through his nose, took off his coat, laid it gently on the ground between them. "No one gets left behind tonight," he said. "Not on my watch." She didn't move, but when he turned, took a step away, and glanced back, she was on her feet, coat wrapped around her shoulders, following, one silent step at a time, back to his place. The shack wasn't much. One room, half buried in the sand ridge, solar panels bolted to the roof. Inside, a cot, a bench, a stove that groaned louder than it cooked. But it was warm, safe. She didn't ask to come in, just stood in the doorway, trembling, as if expecting a trap. Gabe turned on the heater, lit the lamp, pulled an old blanket from the bin. "Sit wherever you want," he said. She didn't sit. Not at first. She wandered the edges of the room, eyes scanning vents, corners, escape points. Finally, she settled near the fire. Not touching it, just watching. He brought her a cup of warm broth. She sniffed it, hesitated, then drank. Slowly, with both hands. "Got a name?" he asked gently. She didn't answer. He didn't push. Later, as he patched the loose panel on the wall, he heard the blanket shift. She'd curled into it, asleep. Still sitting upright, as if sleep was a thing she couldn't do lying down. Gabe sighed, scratched the back of his neck, wrote a single line in the notebook he hadn't touched in years. First contact, female, young, afraid of kindness. He didn't know then how much that one night would change his life. Didn't know what he'd taken in, didn't know that somewhere out there, someone else was looking for her. But in that moment he knew one thing. She was safe now, and whatever happened next, he wouldn't let her go back. Have you ever met someone so used to running? They never took off their shoes, even when the floor beneath them was warm, even when home was finally safe. Morning in the salvage shack arrived with groaning pipes and solar systems sputtering back to life. Gabe Rowan always woke early, even after retirement. Old habits from a life lived under a military clock. But today, something was different. There was silence. Not the heavy kind that follows an argument, not the type that comes with grief. This was the quiet of someone afraid to make noise. Gabe turned over on his cot and saw her, still curled on the floor, wrapped in the blanket, eyes open, watching him. "You sleep at all?" he asked. She blinked once, then sat up slowly, arms hugging her knees. Her boots, scuffed, too large, patched with wire, were still on her feet. "You don't have to run," he said, voice calm. "Not here." She didn't respond, just tucked her feet tighter under the blanket. Gabe stood, stretched, walked to the tiny stove, flicked it on, poured 2 cups of instant tea, set one near her on the ground. Steam drifted between them like a fragile thread of trust. She didn't drink, but she stared at the cup, like it was something she'd seen in dreams. He sat across from her, waited. "My name's Gabe," he said eventually. "You probably guessed that already, but I figured it's polite." She stared at him. "People don't usually tell me their names." "Why not? Names mean something." "To me, they do." She looked down at the tea, held the cup now, didn't drink, just held. "Do you want a name?" he asked. Her voice was soft. "I had one. Once, what was it?" She hesitated, then said, "Talina." Gabe nodded slowly. "That's a good name. Mind if I call you Tali?" She shrugged. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. He'd take it. They didn't talk much that first day. Tali followed him around the junkyard in near silence, small footsteps muffled by sand. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer help, but she watched closely, as if memorizing exits, routes, behavior patterns. At noon, he offered her a protein bar. She broke it in half and handed him the bigger piece. Gabe smiled. "Fair trade?" She nodded. For dinner, he heated ration stew, thick, salty, and terrible. She ate it anyway. That night, she sat by the fire again, still in her boots, still not lying down, still watching the door. Gabe worked quietly at the bench, adjusting an old weather sensor. After a while, he spoke. "I checked the registry. No one's reported a missing girl like you, not on this side of the sector." She didn't respond. "But I'm not going to push." He paused. "You want to stay here, you can. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But no one's going to sell you or chain you, not on my ground." Tali said nothing. But when she stood up to fetch another blanket from the bin, she took her boots off, left them by the door. She didn't say goodnight. But that was the first night she lay down, really lay down. On the cot, Gabe offered. Back turned to the door, face toward the fire. That small shift made something in him ache. She trusted him, just a little. The next morning she was gone, not far. He found her outside, building something from scrap metal and wiring, a tiny figure, a bird, maybe, wings made of capacitor strips, a beak fashioned from a drill bit. He didn't ask where she learned it, didn't ask who taught her. He just handed her a soldering wand and said, "Want to make it fly?" She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. They didn't speak again for hours, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer fearful, it was full. And later that evening she asked a question so soft he almost missed it. "Are you going to keep me?" He looked up from his notes, met her eyes, serious, fragile, hopeful. "If you want to be kept," he said. Tali looked down and whispered, "I do." That night, Gabe wrote in his journal, "The girl with the wire bird has stopped running. For now." Do you remember the exact moment you realized you weren't alone anymore? Not in the comforting way, but in the way that makes the hair on your arms rise? That moment when peace starts to feel too perfect, and you begin to wonder if something's been waiting, just beyond the edge of your new beginning. Tali had been living with Gabe for 2 weeks, and things had settled into a rhythm that felt almost just barely like a life. Mornings began with tinkering, Gabe teaching her how to read old wiring diagrams, how to tell the difference between corroded copper and still salvageable tech. Tali learned quickly, her hands steady, her instincts sharper than most trained mechanics. She smiled more often. Not wide grins, but soft ones, the kind that crept in at the edges when she thought he wasn't watching. Gabe didn't mention them. He didn't want to scare them away. In the evenings she drew, not on paper, but into metal, scrap plates etched with thin lines that told strange stories. Mountains with no sky, creatures with 3 eyes and curled horns, a child with wings made of light. Gabe let her work, only asking one question once. "Are they dreams?" Tali nodded. "Or memories," she said. He didn't ask which she preferred. Then, on the 15th morning, Gabe woke to something unusual. Silence. Not the usual calm silence of desert dawn, but the kind that presses too hard against the eardrums. The kind that means something is listening. He stood, instinct sharpening. Tali was still asleep on the cot, curled beneath 2 blankets, 1 foot peeking out. Her wire bird rested beside her, wings folded. Gabe moved to the front of the shack, checked the scanners. Nothing. No movement on the ridge, no local transmissions. But the power fluctuation on his northern panel had shifted. Minor, subtle, still wrong. He stepped outside. The desert stretched wide, same as always, but he felt it. A presence. Watching. He squinted toward the hills. The old mining road wound through them, half buried by sand and time. There were plenty of hiding spots, plenty of high ground, plenty of shadows. He turned slowly, scanning the sky. A glint, brief. Too sharp to be a bird, too low to be a satellite. He returned inside. Tali was awake now, sitting up, eyes alert. "You feel it too?" she asked quietly. Gabe nodded. "Do you think it's them?" she asked. Not explaining who. Not needing to. "I don't know." She slid off the cot and padded toward him. "I think my mother's still alive." He froze. She'd never mentioned family before. "Why do you think that?" "I dream about her. The way she used to hum, the pattern on her shoulder scales. She said she would come back." Gabe crouched, looked her in the eye. "Tali, has anyone ever told you about false hope?" She nodded. "Then you understand." "I understand most people think it's better to forget." "But you don't?" She looked out the window. "Number, because she's not like them. She fought, she left me to survive." Gabe nodded slowly. "I'll help you look." She turned to him, surprised. "You believe me?" "I believe in the way you said it." For the next few days, Gabe modified the long-range scanner, boosted the signal amplifier, tapped into decommissioned relay towers. They didn't find much. No official alerts, no refugee registries matching Tali's species. But on day 4, a pattern emerged. Movement. Someone traveling just outside the legal grid. No broadcast, no identity tags. But the signature was familiar. Old tech. Crystal-based drive core. The kind the Keith used before they were hunted. He didn't tell Tali everything. Not yet. But she noticed anyway. "You found something," she said, staring at him while he soldered. He didn't deny it. "You think it's her?" "I think someone doesn't want to be found. Which means they probably need help." Tali was quiet for a long time, then said, "If it's not her, will you still let me hope?" Gabe put down the tool, sat beside her. "I won't take that from you. Ever." That night, as Tali slept curled beside the fire again, Gabe stepped out into the cold. The stars were too quiet, the wind too still. And on the far edge of the ridge he saw it again. A figure, distant, cloaked, watching. Gone the moment Gabe blinked. But he knew now someone was coming, and not just for the girl. He returned inside, checked the locks, sat with the pulse rifle across his knees. Not because he feared who was out there, but because he had something worth protecting now. And whoever was watching needed to know. This was not just a junkyard anymore. This was home, and home meant fight back. Have you ever heard your name spoken by a stranger and known deep in your bones that they didn't just know you, they had been searching for you? Gabe Rowan didn't sleep the next night. He sat by the front window of the shack, the pulse rifle resting against his leg, the room lit only by the glow of Tally's handmade fire sculpture. A flickering little metal bird perched on the stove. Its wings shimmered when the heat rose just right. At 0400 hours, he saw movement. Not the kind that darts, the kind that approaches. Deliberate, measured. A figure, cloaked, walking slowly through the sand. The wind did nothing to their steps. Even the dunes seemed to part before them. Gabe stood, quiet, calm. He didn't wake Tally, not yet. He stepped outside. The cold bit through his jacket like teeth, but he held his stance. The figure stopped 10 meters out, lifted one hand, not in threat, in greeting, then lowered the hood. And Gabe's breath caught. She was older than he expected. Gaunt, pale, with scars running down one side of her face like lightning trapped in skin. But her eyes, soft gold with flecks of silver, matched Tally's exactly. She didn't speak for a long time, just stood there. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Is the child here?" Gabe tightened his grip on the rifle. "Who are you?" "My name is Shira," she said, "and the child is my daughter." The wind stopped. Even the desert paused to listen. Inside, a creak. Tali stood in the doorway, wrapped in her blanket, eyes wide. "Mother?" That word, one syllable, and the woman crumbled. Shira fell to her knees in the sand, hands pressed to her face, tears leaving tracks through the dust. Tali ran, no hesitation, no fear. She dropped to the ground beside her and threw her arms around the trembling form of a woman she hadn't seen in... how long? Months? Years? Time didn't matter now. "I knew you'd come," Tali said through tears. "I knew it." Shira held her daughter like someone clutching sunlight. "I couldn't take you with me," she whispered, "but I watched. Every day, I waited for the guards to stop, for the air to be safe. But then, you were gone." Tali nodded into her chest. "I found him," she said. "He didn't sell me." Shira looked up at Gabe, eyes cautious, grateful, broken. "Thank you," she said. He lowered the rifle, stepped forward. "Come inside," he said. "You're half frozen." Shira hesitated, then stood, unsteady. Inside the shack, Gabe gave her tea, a blanket, a chair. She sat in silence for a long time, Tali never more than a few inches away. Finally, Gabe asked, "What happened?" Shira looked at the steam rising from her cup. "They wanted my designs," she said. "The Keith have crystal tech, pure resonance systems. I helped design energy harmonizers before the war. When we lost, they started taking our engineers. Said we were too dangerous to be free." "And Tali?" "She was just a child," Shira said, voice cracking. "But they saw potential. They wanted to raise her under control, obedient. But I ran. I broke my contract, hid her. Told her I'd come back." "You did?" Gabe said. "Too late." "No," Tali said firmly. "Not too late." Shira smiled through the tears. That night, Gabe watched the two of them fall asleep on the cot, curled together like nothing had ever torn them apart. He sat in the corner, notebook open, writing one line. Some reunions don't need words. Just breathe, just presence. He closed the book, turned off the light. And for the first time in years, Gabe Rowan felt like a house had turned into a home. Not because of what was inside, but because of who had found their way to it. Have you ever had peace in your hands, so fragile and rare, that you almost convinced yourself it could last forever, only to feel the first ripple, the first breath of something waiting to take it all away? 3 days passed since Shira arrived. In those days, the shack changed in ways Gabe hadn't realized were possible. Not physically. It was still the same 4 walls, the same stubborn stove, the same dust creeping under the corners of every door. But something new had settled between them. Laughter, software rare, but real. Tali and her mother worked side by side again, Shira teaching her how to stabilize crystal fragments, how to tune their resonance using humming tones instead of tools. Tali had a gift for it. Her fingers danced across the crystals with the precision of someone born to balance light. Gabe watched them from the workbench, pretending to focus on his own repairs. But the truth was, he didn't want to miss a single second. On the 4th night, while Tali slept wrapped in a cocoon of blankets between them, Shira and Gabe sat on the porch. The desert sky stretched wide, star-heavy. Shira spoke first. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, "for keeping her alive, for not asking questions, for just being kind." Gabe shook his head. "You're here now, that's what matters." She looked down at her hands, scarred, strong, but shaking. "I ran because I was afraid," she said. "Not just of them, but of what they turned me into. I stopped being a mother when I left her." "You saved her," Gabe said. "I abandoned her. You survived, so you could come back." Shira looked at him. Her eyes no longer guarded, just tired. "I thought no one would ever say those words to me." He nodded. "I only say what I believe." Then she asked something he didn't expect. "Do you think there's a place for people like me, out here?" He looked at her for a long time, then said softly, "There's a place for anyone who decides to stop running." The moment lingered, delicate, unspoken. They went back inside in silence, but something had shifted. Later that night, Gabe was finishing an update on the solar grid logs when his terminal blinked. Unauthorized ping, low orbit, not local, encrypted signature. He froze. Scanned the data again. Someone was scanning his coordinates, specifically his. It wasn't a random sweep, it was a search. He stood, checked the satellite log from 3 days ago. A small ship had passed through. No beacon, no ID, no registry. Standard profile for bounty vessels working off contract. The ping was a lock-on. They knew someone was here, and they were checking if it was who they wanted. Gabe stepped outside. The wind was heavier now, the sky clearer, too clear. He returned inside and locked the door. Shira was already awake, standing by the fire, eyes sharp. "You felt it," she said. He nodded. "Someone's coming." "Zareth? I'd bet my last circuit." She took a deep breath. "I can run again." "You won't." She turned to him, startled. "Why not?" "Because this time you're not alone, and I won't let them take either of you." She stepped closer, not in challenge, in gratitude. Gabe saw the truth behind her silence. How long she'd lived with her back against the wall. How much strength it took just to stand there now. "I don't have much to offer," she said. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to stay." He looked at her. Really looked. And saw not a fugitive, not a refugee, not a danger, but a woman who had crawled back from darkness, holding her daughter's name like a torch. You already have, he said. That night, as they reinforced the perimeter sensors and tested the emergency shielding, Tally stirred in her sleep. She didn't wake, but her lips moved, and Gabe, kneeling beside her, caught the word, family. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he believed that maybe, just maybe, this broken, dusty corner of the stars had become something more than a hiding place. It had become theirs. Have you ever known something was coming, and prepared for it with everything you had, yet still felt your heart stutter when it finally arrived? The desert winds howled that night. Not softly, like breath through chimes, not cold, like before a storm, but angry, like something was stirring that had no business waking. Inside the shack, Gabe Rowan finished checking the last of the motion-triggered perimeter charges. Not explosives, just flash bursts, sound grenades. Enough to buy time. Time was all they needed. Shira stood across from him, her hands shaking only slightly as she adjusted the feedback loop on the makeshift signal jammer they'd built out of scrap and old comms gear. It wouldn't block a military scan, but it could confuse a bounty ship's short-range lock. Tally was asleep again. They'd kept her in the dark about what was coming. Not because she couldn't handle fear, she'd lived in it for too long, but because tonight she deserved peace. Even for a few hours more. Gabe stood at the window, watched the sky shift, and then he saw it. No lights, no engines, just a ripple, a shimmer of gravity distortion, and a silhouette sliding through the clouds like a knife through soft cloth. "They're here," he said. Shira moved beside him. She wore no armor, no gun, but there was something unbreakable in the way she stood. Gabe turned to her. "You still have time to hide." She didn't answer, didn't blink. "I'm done hiding." The ship landed silently a kilometer out, masked by a stealth field. But Gabe had mapped the terrain too many times to be fooled. He set the auto turrets to passive defense. He didn't want blood. He wanted a warning. When the first intruder crossed the ridge, the ground lit up with silent light, blue pulses that sent vibrations into the air, harmless but unmistakable. Tally sat up on the cot, eyes wide, not with fear, with memory. They came like that the first time. Gabe crouched beside her. "You stay here, under the crawl platform. If anything happens, you run to the northern ravine. Shira will guide you." "What about you?" He hesitated, then smiled. "I've always wanted to know how well this junkyard would hold up under pressure." Tally grabbed his hand. "Don't let them take her." "I won't," he said. "Either of you." Outside, boots touched sand. Gabe stepped into the open. A man in sleek body armor stood at the edge of the main path, flanked by two others. They were armed, but not raised. The lead stepped forward, visor lifting. His face was sharp, clean. Too clean for this kind of job. "Gabriel Rowan," the man said. Gabe didn't respond. "You're harboring a fugitive. Keith classification, female. Known escapee of New Verge facility. Genetic tag matches an asset we've been contracted to retrieve." Gabe tilted his head. "And who hired you?" The man smiled. "Information above your clearance." "Then I guess, access denied." The man sighed, signaled to his partners, then said, without heat, "Step aside. We don't want violence." Gabe stepped forward instead. "Funny thing," he said, "neither do I." And pressed the trigger. The ground erupted, blinding lights, sonic booms, enough to disorient even with shielding. Gabe ducked, rolled behind the perimeter post and fired a warning shot. The bounty hunters scrambled for cover. Inside, Shira took Tally by the hand, pulled open the crawl door, and guided her into the escape tunnel. But Tally stopped. "I can help." "No," Shira said. "You live. That's how you help." Back outside, Gabe was holding them off. but only barely. The flash bursts were dying. The turret's battery sputtered. The lead bounty hunter stood again, raised his rifle. A shot rang out, and his gun flew from his hands, hit by a crystal-powered bolt from behind. Shira. She stood at the shack's threshold, her hands glowing with resonance energy she hadn't used in years. "I told you," she said, voice low. "I'm not running anymore." Gabe took the chance, moved fast, disarmed the second attacker, pinned the third. By the time the bounty hunters regrouped, the shack was surrounded by noise, by defiance, by light. And then came the roar of engines. A local patrol cruiser, alerted by the unregistered ship's descent. Shira had pinged them during the distraction. Reinforcements landed, the bounty hunters froze, and slowly lowered their weapons. "Bad contract," Gabe muttered. "Terrible," Shira agreed. Later, as dawn crept over the hills, Gabe, Shira, and Tali stood together, watching the sky clear. "You were willing to die for us," Tali whispered. Gabe looked at her. "No," he said. "I was willing to live for you. That's the difference." And for the first time, Tali smiled without shadows behind it. Have you ever held a piece of paper so simple, so ordinary, yet it changed everything, because for the first time, the world had to recognize what your heart already knew? The storm passed. Not the weather, though the desert had coughed up a fine layer of red dust across every panel and window, but the other kind of storm. The kind made of guns, men, fear, and choices. 3 days after the bounty hunters fled, the patrol cruiser returned, not with threats, but with questions, reports, investigations. Gabe sat at his workbench, Tali perched beside him with a crystal shard in hand. She traced its edges like a prayer. Shira stood near the door, arms crossed, not as a barrier, but as a mother. The officer, an older man with a scar down his neck and no patience for nonsense, glanced at his tablet again. "So, let me get this straight. She," he pointed to Shira, "was held without cause. You," now to Gabe, "provided sanctuary. And the child was orphaned by a forced labor operation?" "Yes," Gabe said calmly. The officer rubbed his temples. "I should write you up for obstruction. You could, but I'm not." Gabe arched a brow. "That's unlike most of your kind." The officer gave a tired grin. "My kind? You mean the ones who've seen too much to trust anyone? Or the ones who lost family to war and now pretend policy fixes pain?" Gabe didn't reply. Didn't need to. The officer sighed, then reached into his case, pulled out 3 forms and slid them forward. "I can't undo what was done to your people," he said to Shira. "But I can register you under protection status, limited clearance, no extradition." She blinked, quietly took the papers. "And the girl," the officer added. Tali looked up. Suddenly small again, the officer softened just a little. "You're too smart for your age, kid, too quiet. That's how I know you've seen things no child should." She nodded once. He tapped the last form. "This one's different," he said. "It's not for her, it's for him." He looked at Gabe. "She needs a name, a guardian, a permanent one." Gabe stared at the paper. It was nothing, really, just a standard adoption form, digital, basic fields, but it felt heavier than any rifle he'd carried. He picked up the stylus, signed it. No hesitation. The officer gathered his files. "Keep your nose clean, Rowan. You're on more radars than you realize." Then he left. And for the first time since Tali arrived, Gabe felt like he could exhale. Tali hugged him, tighter than ever before. "Does this mean I get to stay forever?" she asked. He smiled. "It means no one can say otherwise." Later that night, they celebrated in their own quiet way. Gabe fixed up the old comms tower with a signal booster. Tali programmed it to broadcast lullabies from her mother's planet. Shira cooked, a stew that didn't taste like rations or regret. They sat outside as stars blinked into view. No fear, no threat, just them. Tali looked at the sky, then at Gabe. "Can I choose a last name?" "Of course," he said. She smiled. "Ridge, because that's where you found me." Gabe's throat tightened. "Tali Ridge," she said softly. "Daughter of nowhere, loved by someone anyway." Shira took her hand. "And what about me?" Tali looked up at her mother. "Can't we all be Ridge?" Shira laughed, soft and real. And that night, in a place made of junk and stubbornness and unexpected love, a family took shape, not by blood, not by law alone, but by choice. Have you ever stepped outside one morning and realized your world had quietly become beautiful? Without ceremony, without permission, just because the people in it refused to let it remain empty? 6 weeks after the night of the attack, the desert around Gabe Rowan's salvage yard looked different. Not in the dramatic way. There were no towers, no flags waving in the wind, no signs declaring change. But the changes were there, subtle, real. There was a line of small stepping stones from the front door to a flat patch of sand where weeds once clung and refused to die. Now there were rows of pale green shoots, stubborn little plants climbing up from nutrient-poor soil because Shira whispered to them every morning, as if they could hear her faith. There was a new wind chime over the window, built from old parts. Metal coils, wire scrap, glass beads Tali had found in the scrap heap. It didn't ring like earth chimes. Its tone was softer, layered, almost musical. Alien. Gabe had reinforced the walls, built a second room. The shack was still simple, still quiet, but it no longer felt temporary. It felt chosen. That morning, Gabe sat on the porch with a mug of synth coffee in hand, watching Tali dance between the plants. She had tied scraps of ribbon around each row, color-coded. Not for beauty, for science. She was testing sun angles, soil depth, water cycles. 9 years old, and already publishing notes in a weathered notebook with star charts and sketches of leaf growth. She'd given herself a title, Official Botanist of Ridge Homestead. Shira came out behind him, laid her hands gently on his shoulders. Her eyes were still tired, but now that tiredness came from living, not from surviving. "She wants to build a greenhouse," she said. Gabe nodded. "I figured she would. She already marked out the layout, wants to recycle the left solar panel." "I'll order more," he said. "We'll need better insulation anyway." Shira sat beside him. For a moment, they just watched Tali laugh. It was a rare sound, still new, still fragile, but it grew stronger every day. Gabe reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the old journal, the one he hadn't written in since the night he found her. He flipped to the last page, scrawled 3 words. She stayed safe. Then he closed it, handed it to Shira. She turned it in her hands. "What now?" she asked quietly. "We keep going," Gabe said. "We build, we make dinner, we argue over what color the fence should be. There's no fence. There will be. Tali wants one made of polished stone." Shira chuckled. "And you'll make it?" "She asked. I don't say no to her." The wind shifted, software warm. Shira looked at him. "There's something I've been meaning to say." He turned. She didn't hesitate. "Thank you for not just saving her. Thank you for giving her back to me in pieces, and helping me put them back together." Gabe swallowed hard, then said, "Thank you for staying." Later that day, Tali called them over to see the sprout of the first flower. It wasn't much, a single stalk, a tight bud. But it bloomed that afternoon, small, blue, bright against the sand. Tali knelt beside it, then whispered something to the flower. Neither adult could hear what she said. But when she looked up, there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Peace. Not the kind you're given, the kind you claim. That night, the three of them sat beneath the stars. No enemies, no alarms, no running. Just family. And if you've ever loved someone not because of what they gave you, but because of who you became when you were with them, then you already know why this story mattered. If stories like this remind you of someone you once called family, or someone who chose you, we'd love to hear about them in the comments. Sometimes, all it takes is one real story to light up the galaxy.